Hi, I'm Jon Atack.
I'm Sam Atack.
And today we're going to talk about Erich Fromm. I've read The Art of Loving by Erich Fromm about 30 years ago and then put it on the shelf. I came back to him last year because I was interested in what he had to say about Freud, who, as we all know, I don't like very much. We have to accept there were a few things that came.
Yeah, transference.
Transference and projection are quite useful. Not anymore. But I also, because we use this term malignant narcissism so often, and it's contracted down to narcissism, which is a bit worrying because they aren't the same thing. So I wanted to find out what Fromm had said about narcissism, because he's the guy that actually first gave us the term malignant narcissism in a 1964 book called The Heart of Man. And so I read that and read his greatness and limitation in Freud's thought. And then I reread The Art of Loving and found that 30 years later, I really agreed with most of what he was saying. I don't remember what I thought the first time, but I have read the book because it got my little pencil marks all the way through it. Very strange. And I was struck. This is a book written in 1956, year after I was born, or published in 1956 anyway. And it just seemed that it really got hold of something that is lost in contemporary psychology.
Yeah.
Contemporary psychology seems to be so focused on tiny little details and minutiae and trying to build a pattern which has basically told us that we are robots, we're automata. There is no self, we're just a collection of stuff that's moving along and is stimulated by the outside world into reacting. I think that's a summation of Claude Daniel Dennett's life's work. And it seems strange to me that this was actually being countered by Fromm 65 years ago.
Yeah.
This view was already emerging and he was already saying no, and this is why it's wrong. It seemed to me that he gives a foundation out of which to create a decent philosophy of humanity, a new humanism, and that he's been put aside. He was very, very popular. The Art of Loving, the edition I have, says that it already sold 7 million copies. So it's well known. I'm about halfway through The Sane Society, which was written the year before, which is also a remarkable book. So I had Sam read The Art of Loving. He had a birthday, so I gave him a book. It cost £3.
Yeah, excuse.
And so we've, between us, sorted out quotations that we like. And I just want to put it in the framework, firstly, that he offers a view that says we can be either life-affirming or life-denying. And there's it's an overall equation of how life-affirming or life-denying we are. But also we can be life-affirming in some ways and life-denying in others. So at the one end of that spectrum, we'd say we have the psychopath, the criminal psychopath, who is life-denying. And sadly, these people tend to achieve positions of power. He would talk about the malignant narcissist as that person.
Right.
Person who's completely self-involved. They don't care about other people, which we'll get in some of the details of.
And you can also have life-denying empaths as well, right?
I would think it's possible because you can weaponize an empath and get them to work against things. So if you can, the example we always come back to is Heinrich Himmler, who from his notes, diaries and letters appears to have been a compassionate and empathetic man, as long as you weren't Jewish or a Romani or black or a communist or a journalist or disabled. But he was a very kindly man and the founder and head of the Schutzstaffel and the SS and the head of the Gestapo. So he headed the extermination program. And yet he appears not to have had the characteristics of a malignant narcissist or a criminal psychopath, but of a weaponized empath, somebody whose desire to do good and idealism have been caught up in a hateful, destructive philosophy, an absolutely life-denying philosophy. The second idea is not a scale that runs from narcissism through to love. That a person can be narcissistic, and Fromm denies the Freudian idea. It's Freud who puts forward the modern idea of a narcissist. And Fromm says that Freud was wrong to say that a narcissist is somebody who loves themselves, only themselves. He says a narcissist is somebody who doesn't know how to love.
Yeah. And
I think that's just a revelation in terms of its importance. I was reading Maps of the Mind by Charles Hampton Turner, and his little summary of Fromm, and he misses that point. He thinks that narcissism is self-love, and the narcissist has no self. That's Fromm's idea, so they're desperate to have the reflection of the people around them.
I mean, as he says, he quotes, love thy neighbour, that if you can't love as you would yourself, and if you can't love yourself, then you can't possibly love other people. Yeah,
and if you can't love other people, you can't love yourself.
Yeah.
I think probably work round that way as well. So his notion is that we should be life-affirming, we should be loving, and that is the foundation of humanism. He isn't really bothered about what people believe in religious terms or not. He himself was an atheist, but he thinks religion can be a very good thing if it is life-affirming and loving. So let's get to the first quotation. This is from The Art of Living by Erich Fromm.
Mature love is union under the condition of preserving one's integrity, one's individuality. Love is an active power in man, a power which breaks through the walls which separate man from his fellow men, which unites him with others. Love makes him overcome the sense of isolation and separateness, yet it permits him to be himself, to retain his integrity. In love, the paradox occurs that two beings become one and yet remain two.
So I think that's pretty much the core of his idea. And something I agree with. We've just watched Made in America about O.J. Simpson, thinking that it was going to be a 45-minute documentary. It turned out to be 6 hours long. And it's absolutely stunning to see this man who is the perfect example of a narcissist. That he is looking for adulation, he's looking for, and I think probably a lot of, a fair amount of sports personalities are driven by this need to not be empty, to not be separate, to feel loved and wanted. And in his case, he was an absolutely remarkable footballer. There's no doubt about that. It's not a sport I watch, but, seeing clips of him
dart around,
just amazing. But then when he talks, you get this thing about, I call it saintly narcissism, and I know I'm not the only one who does that. But where somebody is basically saying, but I'm a good person. I've only ever tried to help people. I've always been nice to people. There's all of this front. And then you find out that, that didn't include his wife, Nicole Brown, of course, or the young man that he murdered at the same time. I interviews with Lance Armstrong, the cyclist, who very openly admitted to having taken loads of drugs to win the Tour de France 7 times. Interviews with him really struck me as what do you mean? I'm absolutely wonderful. How could anybody have any complaint about me? I'm the best. I'm the greatest. Okay, so I broke the rules a little bit, but everybody does that.
Yeah.
There's an important distinction, I think, which is not usually made. People are using the word narcissist without going, well, why did Fromm say malignant narcissist? And it's rather like the word cult. The word cult actually doesn't have a value judgment in it. You can have a destructive or malignant cult, and you can have a constructive or benign cult, benevolent indeed cult. And the same is true with narcissism, that there's a form of it that is benign. And this confuses people.
The stage performer.
The stage performer. And, of course, the athlete who has a sense of self given by the crowd, but isn't malignant, isn't going to do harm.
Doesn't try and fill it the other way as O.J. Simpson did.
So a person, that they'll put something into the community. I mean, I was very impressed to find out how much money the Dave Matthews Band,
they're really,
they just pour money into their community to help. And they're show-offs. All performers are show-offs to some extent, because otherwise you end up like Nick Drake, the great Nick Drake, who couldn't go on a stage. So he was a brilliant musician who recorded 3 remarkable, if somewhat depressing, albums, and ended up killing himself because he was afraid of the public. So you have somebody who's absolutely not narcissistic. Whereas if we look to Elton John or David Bowie, I'd say that, they have a certain narcissism. They like to go and perform, put high boots on and funny spectacles. But they contributed something to society, and we don't hear about them, beating up their fans or doing anything horrible to their groupies. Well, I haven't heard any of that. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But so there is also benign narcissism, but it's still narcissism. And hopefully, and I think in looking at Elton John and David Bowie, they're very good examples that you watch interviews of them when they were younger. And then as they get older, they become more considerate of other people. And you can find, narcissists who've learned how to put on a front. And there was a talk show where somebody said he'd been on this talk show with an actor, and after the talk show he said to the actor, "Wow, what a wonderful person you are." And the actor looked at him and said, "I'm an actor." It was a show. Okay, the next one.
The teacher is taught by his students. The actor is stimulated by his audience. The psychoanalyst is cured by his patient.
It's a very profound statement. That in an authoritarian world, the teacher teaches the pupils and learns nothing and is the boss. The actor is above the audience and more important, as all narcissists must be. And the therapist is basically exhibiting control, and I'm afraid this is all too often the case, that because of their own inadequacies, which they'll be projecting out onto their patients, onto their clients, that therapists can actually do a lot of harm by pushing somebody back into an authority relationship. Curiously, Freud himself talked about this, that he said that the therapy that Josef Breuer first used on Anna Fourneau, which was entirely unsuccessful, she ended up in an asylum for her morphine addiction, signed in by Josef Breuer, who had actually prescribed her the morphine. So that was the end of the first psychoanalysis, or attempt at it. But Freud himself dismissed that method, which would later be employed by Ron Hubbard as Dianetics, pretty much. They're very similar to what Breuer did. He dismissed it because it didn't resolve the transference. And the whole core of his idea at that time, and he was speaking in 1909 when he said this in the Clark Lectures in Worcester, Massachusetts, it didn't resolve the transference. It didn't bring the person into an adult, mature relationship with others. The person was still in an authoritarian dependence on others in their relationships. And he said, in fact, it made it worse. That what would later become Dianetic therapy made people more dependent on the therapist. So therefore in life more susceptible to being enslaved, as we later found. The next one. This one, we both pulled quotations out. This is one that Sam pulled out.
While the great popularity of psychology certainly indicates an interest in the knowledge of man, it also betrays the fundamental lack of love in human relations today. Psychological knowledge thus becomes a substitute for full knowledge in the act of love, instead of being a step towards it.
So studying something can sometimes mean that you don't know the thing. And I think this is a terrible problem in our education system, the idea that you can analyse something down, break it down into its parts.
Know all its components parts.
But have no capacity to actually do what's being said. It's all, it makes sense that you analyse something down into its smaller parts and learn those parts, and you should be able to do it. But it's rather like the way I was taught languages at school, that they are analysed down into the parts of grammar. And so you had ich bin, du bist, er, sie, es ist, and you'd learn all of these things, and then you'd learn, in French, the 13 irregular verbs, which come to pam, end, 5 trams, where the 5 is a V. Partir, whatever.
Yeah.
That they have odd endings. This is not how we acquire language. It's an analytical approach to language.
Yeah, I mean, I felt with my schooling that it was so broken down into the analytical and the memorization and the I'll explain that later sort of thing, that it sort of forgot left out the reason why we should be learning these things in the first place, which, as far as I can see, is a pro-social thing.
And it to be life-affirming. I mean, Michael Thomas, the greatest of language teachers, basically said, you already know 2,000 French words because every word that ends I-O-N in English is a French word. So he started by including pupils. He said you don't have to take notes, you don't have to understand the grammatical structure or any of that stuff. In a few days, I can teach you the basis of a language. And he did. I mean, Woody Allen claimed to have learned 11 languages from him in 11 weekends. If Woody Allen is to be trusted.
Probably.
I don't see why not when it comes to language. Okay, the next one, which again is one that you picked out.
The outside reality, persons and things, have meaning only in terms of their satisfying or frustrating the inner state of the body. Real is only what is within. What is outside is real only in terms of my needs, never in terms of its own qualities or needs.
And this is a definition of the narcissist.
The solipsistic definition.
The narcissist at the extreme becomes completely solipsistic. Robert J. Lifton said of Donald Trump that he is not a narcissist. He is a solipsist. And I was very struck by this because that was the conclusion I'd come to about Ron Hubbard, having spent far too many years digging through his history and his relationships with people and his writings, that it is as if we are just creatures of the imagination, figments of the imagination to a solipsist. A solipsist is somebody who believes that they are the only real living being, that everything else is simply expression of themselves, which is pretty much how Freud defined what he called primary or core narcissism, that the baby is born with the world inside it and only separates from the world, by the age of 2. And I think Piaget pretty much went along with this from his observations, that by the age of 2, the baby has become aware that there are things on the outside. And we then get the terrible 2s. We get the attempt to control the outside world, which, frankly, most of my children didn't go through, so that's quite nice, really. And that, a balance is struck. But an aspect of maturing, Freud believed that you could never overcome narcissism, that it was the basic state. He calls secondary narcissism, which is adult narcissism. And it's a very cynical view of humanity, which Fromm, as an early pupil of psychoanalysis, he studied in Berlin in 1929. He immediately, while he was studying, said, this is wrong. These ideas are wrong. But this idea is quite interesting, And he gradually rejected the idea that sex is the basis of love, that all of our love for others is based in our lust in some way, which never made any sense to me. I never fancied my mum. What can I say? The next one, again, one of Sam's. Sam's picks.
Sam's picks. God, my own self must be as much an object of my love as another person. The affirmation of one's own life, happiness, growth, freedom, is rooted in one's capacity to love. If he can love only others, he cannot love at all.
And this brings us into stark contrast with the Christian notion of complete sacrifice of the self. in the Imitation of Christ, which we find, say, in the life of St. Francis.
Yeah.
St. Francis of Assisi.
Apologising at the end of his life to his body for working it so hard.
The poor donkey, as he called
poor donkey.
Yeah. And, I mean, he's a fascinating character. That's a whole other conversation. He's a remarkable character, and I want to emphasise that I'm not making any criticism of this astonishing man. At the end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th century, he sought to become a pure Christian, but that meant that he kissed lepers, he destroyed his own physical self in the service of God from his perception, and that is thought of as saintly behaviour, and I guess it is. Greater love hath no man known than to give his own life for those around. I accept that, but I feel that it is important. I hesitate at the concept of self-love. It does seem to me a little narcissistic, having just said what we've said. But I do think that if you dislike yourself, if you hate yourself, if you loathe yourself, then you will have significant difficulty in loving others. And that if you can love others, you can reflect that back. And I think feeling okay about yourself is about where I come to, not disliking yourself.
And not attacking yourself.
Not attacking yourself. And being willing to consider criticism and, things about yourself that you might improve.
But nonetheless thinking that you yourself have the potential to achieve certain unique things just as everybody else does.
Yeah, and that it is a matter of finding your talents and exploring them. And as we've said before in these conversations, if you have done something horribly wrong, then doing something dramatically right is a solution to that, rather than flogging yourself and going mea culpa. It is good to admit what you've done wrong, and it's good then to do something about it, which of course in the Christian faith is called an act of contrition. But they become formulaic, so that you're saying this many Hail Marys or something, rather than actually doing something, some community service, as they call it in legal terms. We seem to have, it's my fault, I've inserted something in the wrong place there. I don't think it matters. Let's go with that one.
Okay.
This again is one that Sam drew from the book.
The faith in others has its culmination in faith in mankind. In the Western world, this faith was expressed in religious terms in the Judeo-Christian religion, and in secular language it has found its strongest expression in the humanistic, political and social ideas of the last 150 years. Like the faith of a child, it is based on the idea that the potentialities of man are such that given the proper conditions he will be capable of building a social order governed by principles of equality, justice and love, and has not yet achieved the building of such an order, and therefore the convictions that he can do so requires faith. But like all rational faith, this too is not wishful thinking, but based upon the evidence of the past achievements of the human race, and on the inner experience of each individual, on his own experience of reason and love.
Now, Erich Fromm got into trouble. He was a founding member of what's called the Frankfurt School in Germany in the late 1920s, early 30s. He fled Germany because he was a Marxist. He changed his mind and, modified his views, but still looked to certain ideas in Marx. And you can say that Marx, for example, believed in the equality of women.
Yeah,
mad idea. As Queen Victoria pointed out, it's a crazy idea. So he took from Marx what he thought was good and worthwhile. We are not Marxists. Are you a Marxist? Marx brothers, maybe, but not their cousin Karl. But there are ideas in there that have value, no doubt. But he was a Marxist who was also Jewish, and he finds himself in Germany in 1933 after Hitler has come to power, and he gets out as quickly as he can, goes to America. And he's unusual in that he had not only studied psychoanalysis or clinical psychology, he'd also studied social psychology. And I think it's a tremendous lack. I think all clinical psychologists should, as my friend Jessica, who is a clinical psychologist, says, should study social psychology, because social psychology comes closer to being scientific. Clinical psychology is kind of, I think, wandered off, and we're into all sorts of fads and cults.
Yeah.
Which, if you believe in them, they'll work.
Yeah, again, which mostly increase dependence on the counsellor.
Yeah. And the method. And the teachers, the great, wonderful people like Freud who gave us the holy teaching. It does really get that way. But Fromm went to America, published a book called Escape from Freedom in 1941, which is an astonishing study. That was what got me starting from reading Fromm again a couple of years ago, on Alan Shefflin's recommendation, in fact. And in Escape from Freedom, he talks about how the Nazis took over and what is wrong with humanity to follow these authoritarian thugs. And, they were authoritarian thugs. There's film. You can see them doing horrific things to people. They were not nice. He becomes popular because of that book, and then just carries on producing more work and thinking harder and harder. At that time, one of the concepts he'd come up with, which would become very relevant to the idea of narcissism, was the pseudo-self. And that is somebody who, they don't have a sense of their own achievement, their own powers, their own talents. They instead look for approval from the outside. So we have the keeping up with the Joneses, that you have to buy something does them. You have externalizing your status into your motor vehicle. So you have to buy a new car, 2 years, or what have you.
And the idea of individuation, that you have to keep making yourself look new, keep buying, keeping up with the new.
Yeah, which is an incredible shift from the 19th century, where having nice things and looking after them was important, not replacing them every 2 years, and has led to the consumer society, which in turn is destroying the human habitat, the human environment, at a tremendous rate.
Yeah.
When you look at what Bolsonaro has done in the Amazon rainforest in the last 2 years alone, it's unprecedented, the destruction that is going on, and the lack of realization. The idea, well, you cleared all of your forests, you people in Europe, so why shouldn't we do it? Why shouldn't we profit from it? Well, because we are chopping down the air that we breathe, to quote Blues Traveller. So Fromm basically comes under attack from the Frankfurt School, of which he's been a member, because he says Freud was wrong about this, Freud was wrong about that. Marcuse and, what's his face, the Adorno, both wrote quite strenuous attacks on Fromm. And the other thing that they thought was a problem was that he was optimistic. He thought that humanity could come to a better solution. And of course, Freud's idea is that you've just got to accept that you're a narcissistic and neurotic person, and you'll never be secure. And
the death of society is just a second.
Yeah, and that everything is based upon libido, the lust to have sex, which is balanced by the wish to be dead, the death wish, which later Freudians called thanatos, which is a rather childish conception, frankly, and Adorno and Marcuse should have been ashamed of themselves, such intelligent men being fooled by such a simplistic set of ideas. Fromm was pulling something positive out of all of this, which, he is a humanist. Okay, back to this one.
Eventually, the mature person has come to the point where he is his own mother and his own father. He has, as it were, a motherly and a fatherly conscience.
I experienced this very directly, that 26 years this year since my dad died, and we had really very little relationship until I was in my 30s. He apologised to me a few months before he died for never having spent any time with me as a child, which wasn't, I don't think, entirely true, but we did spend some time together. It was just that it was a time where he would talk but not listen. And he told me he'd been so overwhelmed. And given the incredible life he'd led, Dunkirk, Normandy, the liberation of Belsen, he was there. He had a rotten childhood with an incredibly malignant narcissist mother who I did know. And he was decidedly weird. And yet he managed to maintain a house, keep a big garden, and, look after the financial needs of 4 spud gobblers, which was his affectionate term for us. And he was a man of some humour. He was very rarely angry, and even more rarely aggressive in any way. I only remember one incident throughout my whole childhood where he was aggressive. But he was nonetheless not connected with us. There wasn't an attachment to us. And it was only in my 30s, as I say, that, and I was just 39 when he died, that we came to actually have, I think, one of the closest relationships he ever had, because he talked to me about what he believed. And I'm not sure that he talked to anybody else about what he believed. And I don't want this to be a spoiler, but he said that the traditional Jewish view was what he accepted. I'm not going to get into whether he was correct about this, which is that God exists, but there is no afterlife. So you're going right back to the earliest origins of Judaism, Babylonian religion, where you had the place of shades, the abyss, which is a word from the Sumerian. So thousands of years old, but there's this place underneath the earth, because of course it's a flat earth. And that's where the shadows or shades of men will wander. So it's not quite that there's no afterlife, it's just that it's not worth having. Basically.
Right.
It got better and better with time. When my mother died in 2011, and I'd had the good fortune of looking after her through the last years, I found myself parentless. And I really did. I'd already read Fromm and put it away years before, but I really did have that sense that, now that is the process of maturation, that I become my own parent. I am not looking for an authoritarian figure to tell me what to do. I'm not looking for Erich Fromm to tell me what to do. I am deciding on things for myself, coming to conclusions for myself, and that's part of maturity.
And if we put forward what his view of what mother and father's role, I mean, he doesn't say that it should be gender specific in any way.
He makes a specific point that it shouldn't be gender specific, but he says that maternal love is unconditional love. Doesn't matter what you do, I'll always love you. And paternal love is conditional. It has discipline within it, it has rules, and you have to please the paternal figure. You have to do things that demonstrate, whereas the maternal figure will be pleased with you, even if you turn out to be Hitler. I'm not sure that Hitler's mum was pleased with him, actually. Poor woman. Given Hitler's father and what he was like, horrible bloke. Because I have 4 children and have been, to some extent, a sole parent. Your older brother moved in with me when he was 12 and lived with me for the next 7 years. So I brought him up. But I saw early on in relationships that I would probably have to be the maternal as well as the paternal. And it is a conflict. I think it is better for children to have 2 parents. And I think that, the single parents that I've met, there have been some incredible people. But their time is completely taken up in parenting because they have to form these 2 almost contradictory roles. So unconditional love, which I think is helpful to us all. My mother certainly exhibited that towards me. That was fantastic. She was a wonderful mother. It didn't mean that she didn't criticise me. It did mean that she didn't criticise me. She would criticise what I had done, possibly. But, it wouldn't be, you're stupid. You're always doing that. It would be, I don't like this thing that you did. And even that didn't happen very often. It'd be like if I cooked her something that she didn't like, she'd tell me then, the important things. Whereas my father was somebody that, because he was remote, I'd take something to him for his approval. I remember when I was about 15, and I'm at school, and I'd done a painting that I was quite pleased of, and I remember showing it to him. And he looked at it and he said, "Yes, but can you make money from it?" And it seemed an incredibly, I get what he was talking about, and I can't make money from it. So what are you going to say? But he was concerned for our welfare, and that's a fatherly role. But it would have been nice if you said, "Oh, that's great,"
and then put the comment in.
But of course, it's difficult to survive as an artist in a culture that's completely Philistine, like the one that we live in. Right. Okay, big one here.
Oh. Deep breath. Love is not primarily a relationship to a specific person. It is an attitude, an orientation of character, which determines the relatedness of the person to the world as a whole, not towards one object of love. If a person loves only one other person and is indifferent to the rest of his fellow men, his love is not love, but a symbiotic attachment, or an enlarged egotism. Yet most people believe that love is constituted by the object, not by the faculty. In fact, they even believe that it is a proof of the intensity of their love when they do not love anybody except the loved person. Because one does not see that love is an activity, a power of the soul. One believes that all that is necessary to find is the right object. This can be compared to a man who just wants to paint, but who, instead of learning the art, claims that he has just to wait for the right object, and that he will paint beautifully when he finds it. Like that.
That is such a remarkable metaphor, or a simile, if you prefer. It is both. This notion of, I'll just wait until I see a beautiful enough, and then I'll be able to paint it. And that's why there is an art of loving. That's why it is something you have to practice. It's something you have to work at. And we'll come to it. But the sense of the other person's needs are equal to your own. Now, hopefully, when you have children, that will be automatic. That you so often hear a parent saying, "I wish I could suffer the pain, not the child."
Yeah.
I wish nobody would suffer the pain. But that sense of protection and looking after the needs of another, if we can foster that as an attitude towards humanity, then we might be able to solve some of our problems. It becomes interesting because I'm talking about fostering love also for the malignant narcissist, also for the criminal psychopath. But I think love for such people means containing them, means helping them not to be life-denying towards other people. And that, that's a difficult idea. It's very hard to think of loving somebody like Ted Bundy, but to love him, you lock him up, basically.
Yeah. Don't deprive him. Just make sure he can't Ted Bundy people.
Yeah. Don't hurt him. Don't act in a life-denying fashion towards him, but lock him up and study him to find out if what it is that led him to become a monster, serial killer on a grand scale. Okay, the nice simple one next.
Okay. Is there a basic contradiction between love for oneself and love for others? Is love for oneself the same phenomenon as selfishness, or are they opposites?
And again, he hits a fundamental point and something that we don't tend to have thought about. I am shifting towards the view that even talking about malignant narcissism might not be the right focus. that it might be better to look at the symptom rather than giving a name. So again, the word cults, people frequently come to me these last 36 years and say, somebody I know is involved in this group, is it a cult? And I say, is it harming them? I'm not really concerned whether we can put it in some general category, because that abstraction into a general category often means that we don't see what's happening. The symptom of the human predator is selfishness. That they do what they do for their own ends. They're charming and they apologise. They do all sorts of things that are done solely for their own ends. As we see O.J. Simpson, if we look at when he was convicted and sentenced to 33 years in prison, which did seem a bit excessive for what he'd done, but it seemed justified given what he'd done before, that he'd committed 2 murders before and got away with it. But that he basically makes a statement to the court at the end, which is a pure statement of selfishness, as if he were a saint. He's trying to pretend that he's this great, wonderful person, when he hadn't been. He'd parted a lot, and I think that probably hurt quite a lot of people along the way. Okay, definition of love.
Love is an active striving for the growth and happiness of the loved one.
I think that stands by itself, doesn't that? It's, I want good things for me, and I want good things for you.
Yeah.
If I just want good things for me, then that's selfishness. If I just want good things for you, there's something wrong with me. It's like, I'm going to eat porridge. Actually, Dan eats porridge, doesn't he? So it's not necessarily all bad. I'm going to eat unsweetened porridge, Scottish porridge with salt in it, gruel, so that you can eat, I don't know, lobster probably, unless you're feeling a bit shellfish.
I had to do it.
Sorry about that. That was truly awful and not intended.
Yeah.
So to this one here.
Yep. The affirmation of one's own life, happiness, growth, freedom is rooted in one's capacity to love, i.e. in care, respect, responsibility and knowledge.
It's great. I think everybody should think about that. The affirmation of one's own life, happiness, growth, freedom is rooted in one's capacity to love. That is, in care, respect, responsibility and knowledge. Okay, next one.
Selfishness and self-love, far from being identical, are actually opposite. The selfish person does not love himself too much, but too little. In fact, he hates himself.
That's certainly my experience of narcissistic and selfish people, that they aren't happy. They might be very insistent on you doing what they want.
Yeah.
And they might feel that, if they only had this, or you only did this, that they'd be happy. But when they have whatever it is that they've been striving for, or when you do whatever it is asked, it still won't be enough.
Yeah, and so OJ keeps. There is no meaning to life except the meaning man himself gives to it. Man is utterly alone, except in as much as he helps another. And
2 astonishing statements. I came to the conclusion some time ago that the limit of human meaning is as far as we can get. So the idea that humanity has become all-knowing through science, or will become all-knowing through science, is silly. And it's got all sorts of effects that we've seen religion move from the belief in God. And that's what is meant by God is that's an astonishing range of things. So Maimonides, the Jewish scholar in I think the 11th or 12th century, living in Islamic Spain, writes the Guide for the Perplexed. And the first paragraph, he says, the idea that we are made in the image of God does not mean that we are physically made in the image of God. And you go, well, this is nearly 1,000 years ago. This guy is saying, you've misinterpreted what's being said. We have consciousness and imagination. In that way, we are like God. But God is not a beardy bloke who's holding out a finger to create Adam, which is somewhat sacrilegious, really, isn't it? A violation of the Ten Commandments, the one that says you shall have no graven images. Never mind. let's not get into that because somebody might come and beat us up or burn us at the stake, you know. But, you know, therefore, the view of what God is already quite an interesting sort of idea, but that's within human meaning. And we think of it in those terms. What that translates to in Silicon Valley is all of these people who believe that when the singularity occurs, when all the machines unify themselves into one intelligence, that intelligence will become God, which philosophically is called teleology.
The idea of the free market, that if you just go along with it, this society, this thing will emerge of itself and we'll all fall into the roles that we have to fall into within that. It's very like the Brave New World idea, that we've become part of the tools we've created rather than using them to extend our human meaning.
Yeah, the system takes over, and you know, it's a very good example. Free market capitalism is a religion, or you know, a belief system. Let's call it that. A new religious movement, sociologists would say, if they had a good look at it, because it's based upon an assumption, and that assumption, to some extent, has worked. That the free market, and I'm not sure we've ever actually had a free market, because there are all sorts of subsidies, for example, that are paid, you know, to American farmers or to, you know, aspects of industry. At the moment, Richard Branson is asking for a massive subsidy from government to maintain Virgin Airlines. So that's not a free market. So, you know, one rule for the rich and another for the poor. Free market is for poor people. You know? So, you know, it's your own fault. But it becomes a sacred science, as Robert J. Lifton put it, that you can't question this. You can't say, well, you know, I think the free market has failed because we haven't created a happy and equitable world. There's still tremendous inequality and tremendous suffering being caused by basically some people being way too rich and powerful in what is supposed to be a democracy. I was looking at Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, which he announced during World War II, and they included the freedom from fear and the freedom from want. And in those terms, the freedom from want, we're now in a society that is shifting over, is not really doing very much about want. So in America, 25% of people live below the poverty line. 20% of people in Britain live below the poverty line. So they are not free from want. And we have a society that should be able to provide. But that's another universal basic income. That's another argument which we should certainly have.
Modern man has transformed himself into a commodity. He experiences his life energy as an investment with which he should make the highest profit, considering his position and the situation on the personality market. He is alienated from himself, from his fellow men, and from nature. His main aim is profitable exchange of his skills, knowledge, and of himself, his personality package, with others who are equally intent on a fair and profitable exchange. Life has no goal except the one to move, no principle except the one of fair exchange, no satisfaction except the one to consume.
And I think that's what we were just saying, that in the consumer society, status and identity rely upon goods, not upon activities, not upon the way we behave towards one another. There are legal restrictions on how we behave, some of which are fairly arbitrary. Things we're allowed to do and not do. So in France they have a law that says you can't cover your face, which has been quite interesting, with people having to wear face masks. So, you know, and here in the UK, as I've said before, in Wales, in fact, the police have stopped this guy 6 times for driving around in his car because it's against the law to go out. You've got to stay at home. And it's like, well, I understand that he's wasting petrol, but possibly, but who knows? He's not going to infect anybody. He's not going to become infected as long as the people at the gas station are, keeping their faces covered or what have you in a proper anti-French manner. So we start getting rules and we start living by rules. And one of the aspects of authoritarianism is that there'll be rules, and the rules, you'll never quite live up to them. You'll always be inferior to the rules. The rules will mean that you can't. And there'll be therefore a demand for purity, as Robert J. Lifton puts it, that you'll never be able to meet. And so you'll never be satisfied, you'll never be happy, and you have a miserable time. And I don't think that's what it's about. I don't think we're meant to be having a miserable time just so that some pen pusher somewhere is satisfied that we've, used the right colour paper to write our examinations on, or what have you, and left the margins so that we haven't marked in them. And we become commodities. We ourselves become commodities, and the astonishing wonder of life is lost.
Yeah.
And instead we have the astonishing wonder of television soaps.
That's another reason why I quite like the idea of basic income, because it would allow a lot of scientific or artistic work to be done that would otherwise not be done because it's not valued on the free market.
And there have been so many examples across the centuries of work that's been contributed because of the fascination of the person doing the work. I mean, Charles Darwin, Alfred Wallace, Einstein. This is not something that a corporation hired them to do. And the thought is that if you restrict all research to that which will become commercially profitable, you end up with a situation like the pharmaceutical companies, where it costs them like $1 billion to launch a new drug. So they have to make the money back on it, and they have to go through all of the checks and work. But it's meant that they've been life-denying. They've been anti-human. So if you look at the movie The Constant Gardener, based upon John le Carré's book of the same name, this was a criticism of American drug companies and European drug companies who were actually exploiting Africans by saying, we'll give you medicine for this if you take this as well. Or, then in the States, it moved to using homeless people to, because they'd get somewhere to live while they were taking something that might kill them, but the system itself creates this situation where, and pharmaceutical companies, it's a difficult question. But there's no point in researching a drug that you can't patent. So therefore, anything that might be medicinal, and of course at the moment the big argument is about cannabis, that in the US you have 29 states now that permit it for medical use, 11 that have legalised it completely. Canada and firstly Uruguay have legalised this drug. And here we are, a drug that's been used for centuries as a medicine. In fact, it may be the oldest recorded pharmaceutical. It certainly goes back more than 2,000 years in China. Because it has a euphoric property, the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, it is frowned upon. And it's frowned upon because it makes people feel happy and act in a foolish way at times. But there's no point in pharmaceutical companies doing anything with this. And there have been some small companies, GW Pharmaceuticals in the UK has registered Sativex, for example. It's been shown to be effective in treating muscle spasm, and it's been legal in this country, contrary to what the Home Office themselves say. It's been legal here for 30 years for multiple sclerosis, because it's the only drug that's known to help muscle spasm significantly. The British Medical Association says it's completely safe. Or it was the least toxic drug they've ever experienced, and that was said in the 1980s. The American Medical Association has frequently petitioned the government to be allowed to do trials with cannabis and been turned down repeatedly. We then get into this crazy situation where Richard Nixon, having set up a committee to investigate cannabis, when the committee said legalise it, to use the words of Bob Marley, he lost his temper, announced the war on drugs along the way, and asked the University of West Virginia to do studies to prove that it compromised the immune system. And I mean, you don't really generally set out to prove something in a proper scientific study. You seek to find out.
Yeah.
But he wanted them to prove it. And those tests, the results of those tests were suppressed for many years, which I think is criminal, because they had mice with 3 strains of cancer. All of the mice in the control group died. I believe all of the mice in the cannabis group survived. So it was known, and we're talking about the early 1970s, maybe 74 here, it was known that this drug might have a good effect on cancer. To hide that is just terrible. To not say, well, we're going to put aside the idea of a drug. Again, it's that generalization, cult, drug. You know, aspirin's a drug. Oh, drugs are bad. You know. Is it useful? Is it helpful? And there are now studies going ahead, particularly in Israel, which hopefully will start answering that question. But we know it aids. It's good for pain relief. It's good for muscle spasm. It's good for insomnia. There can't be really very much doubt about that.
Appetite.
It's good for appetite stimulation, and it's used for that with cancer patients who have loss of appetite because of the treatments they're receiving. So it also doesn't appear to have... You can't kill somebody with it, which makes it almost unique among pharmaceuticals. But it means that something is being treated because of a belief system, rather than being like, let's put the beliefs aside and say, is this good for humanity? Is this good for us? And it brings us into, commodification, that we're just commodities, and it's kind of moral imperialism, that you have to do what we say. Why? Because we say it. What's the evidence? I'm going way off subject here, but in 1923, the League of Nations, as it then was, bearing the original United Nations, and the United States did not join the League of Nations. But the Egyptians put forward a proposal that cannabis should be made illegal. It wasn't illegal anywhere at that time, apart from El Paso in Texas, the El Paso Ordinance. I don't know of anywhere else where it was illegal. It had been very thoroughly studied. The assertion was that it drove people mad. That had been incredibly thoroughly studied. 500 specific cases were studied in the late 1880s, early 1890s by the India Hemp Drugs Commission. And that was out of a survey of 10,000 people in all. But 500 cases of mental illness, hospitalisation, were checked. And it was found that basically when the police found somebody acting in a crazy way, they said he's a cannabis user.
Oh, right.
And it was found that in almost none of these cases had the people used cannabis. Exactly the same thing happened in Egypt. The head of the hospitals there was an Englishman who didn't speak Arabic. So he didn't actually conduct any interviews himself. And they went to the League of Nations and said, let's ban this drug. And the League of Nations said no. Britain abstained from that vote. The next year, Canada made cannabis illegal after a juvenile magistrate had written, who called herself Janie Cannock, had published a book called The Black Candle, which said that cannabis would lead to black people, to white women, having sex with black men, and this would mean the mixture of the races. So it's actually Aryan race theory that's behind it. 4 years later, the British Parliament adopted the same measure with absolutely no research. So we've got a little bit away from commodification here, but this idea of not being scientific, and that leads us into the next point that Erich Fromm makes.
The faculty to think is reason. The emotional attitude behind reason is that of humility. To be objective, to use one's reason, is possible only if one has achieved an attitude of humility. If one has emerged from the dreams of omniscience and omnipotence which one has as a child.
I spent many years considering humility, and I sort of thought it's okay to be modest, and being boastful is an aspect of the narcissist. There's no doubt about that. People who go on about how great they are and they do things. It's narcissism. Saying, I think I've done a reasonably good job of this that's great. But saying, look, what a fantastic job I've done at this. I'm so brilliant. It's a little bit of a problem there. So modesty seemed a good quality. It took me a long time to realise that humility, because, in Dickens, you've got Uriah Heep, very humble, who's this horrible character who led to a heavy metal band who were actually quite good, Uriah Heep. That's another conversation altogether. Great heavy metal bands I have known. Not many really. Apart from One Minute Silence, of course, they were fantastic. But they weren't heavy, they were rap. So it's a different thing. That humility is the foundational quality of intelligence. That if you are going to reason, then you have to be willing to criticise everything and anything. Which again brings us to, if we're going to have drug laws, if we're going to make laws based upon the beliefs of one culture, then we need to look at being scientific. We need, and in this country we have the Legal Highs Act, which Theresa May brought in before she became our leader. And it basically is a law that says that anything that makes you happy is illegal. Yeah. Technically, that would include nutmeg, which will also make you sick if you take a lot of it. So I'm told. I don't like it enough to, but you can get stoned on it. And we indeed have tens, probably hundreds of substances that will give you some effect. And the idea that if they don't damage you in any way, they're nonetheless still illegal. And they're illegal because they make you feel happy. And it's meant that all sorts of substances that are used, and there are lots all around the world, Kava, for example, there are just so many of them, that used to be legal and available, and there's no evidence of damage. They're suddenly all made illegal because we've got Prozac.
And alcohol.
Yeah. But you're not meant to take alcohol and Prozac at the same time. So a sip of this. Yeah. Okay, we've got a couple more to go. You want to talk to me?
I was just going to bring back to the Nixon thing. If, again, he'd said, test this rather than prove this. It's humility.
Yeah, and his own scientific commission, and it wasn't the first time. There's the 1914 US Army Panama Commission that says it's okay, cannabis is okay. I say the India Hemp Drugs Commission before that, which I think was 8 volumes of findings. Very intense study. Then you had I think it's the 1944 New York Mayor's Commission, which again found no harm. And I think it's a missing piece of history that during Prohibition, after the Volstead Act in 1919, the prohibition of alcohol led to speakeasies, these illegal clubs where alcohol was served, to bootlegging, to the rise of the Kennedy family, of course. John F. Kennedy's dad made his money as a bootlegger, Joseph Kennedy. And during that time, cannabis was legal. And so there were actually the equivalent of cannabis cafes in New York at that time. And the whole jazz thing came out of it. I think most people probably know that Louis Armstrong wouldn't perform without having cannabis first. Sidney Bechet, the other great founder of jazz, similarly, they talk about vipers. There are all sorts of code words for this, but it's legal. It's legal. And then it becomes illegal. Also, white jazzers as well. Bing Crosby, who was dreaming of a white Christmas. Well, we know what he smoked before he was dreaming of a white Christmas. When his son became an alcoholic, he said, well, why don't you just smoke this stuff like me? So it had a significant artistic effect, and it then becomes criminal, overnight. And it's interesting to think, well, what would have happened if the Volstead Act had continued? Because in terms of the health of Americans, the prohibition of alcohol was a good thing. Statistically, it was helpful. The prohibition of drugs has basically led to increasing numbers of addicts. The number of addicts of opiates only ever has gone down in one period, and that was the period from 1900 to 1915. It's reckoned in 1900, and this is from a Yale professor who wrote a fascinating book, that he's saying, well, in 1900 there started to be stories about morphine particularly being bad for you. And it's reckoned that the number of addicts over the next 15 years dropped from 200,000 to 100,000 in the US. Now, we don't know what cocaine was doing at this time because Freud and others thought it was a brilliant drug, took loads of it. But being alerted to the dangers of morphine, many people stopped using it. Then in 1915, the Harrison Act came in, which started the prohibition, not of cannabis, but of cocaine and of the opiates. And from that time onward, use has increased. And so criminalising it rather than treating it as a health problem and studying it fully and getting a full estimation, we need to approach things rationally. Approaching them from a purely emotional aspect without gathering the information first is a bit silly.
Education is identical with helping the child realise his potentialities. The opposite of education is manipulation, which is based in the absence of faith in the growth of potentialities and on the conviction that a child will be right only if the adults put into him what is desirable and suppress what seems to be undesirable. There is no need of faith in the robot, since there is no life in it either.
And I think education, the opposite of education is manipulation. And I think that's where we're living. Rather than teaching kids to find things out, which the internet is forcing them to do, whether anybody likes it or not, kids are being taught a rote series of ideas that they must memorise and regurgitate. It's not to develop their understanding. And so our current system of education, for the most part, is not education, it is manipulation. Its purpose is to bring about social conformity. Do as you're told. The amount of times I've been told with you and with your younger brother that you have to jump through the hoops. Jump through the hoops. And I'm like, but we don't go to the circus, and what's more, we think that kind of treatment of animals is cruel. So why are you using this metaphor?
I get, jump through the hoops.
Jump through the hoops.
Rather
than letting
the children, encouraging the children to find out things on their own, to be curious. It's memorise all these, do exactly what we say, how we manipulate you, and then something magical will happen at the end. Yeah, sometime around the time you do your doctoral studies, you'll be allowed to think. But until then, jump through hoops. And it's a training without purpose, and a training that's led us astray, because we are living in a society where very few people are capable of thinking. We have this subject called critical thinking, which is frankly a joke, I'm sorry. But they're treating routines of thinking and then setting that in chain, rather than actually teaching people how to think, how to see what is before their eyes and say, why am I emotionally affected by this? I mean, that's the big question. We've just talked about cannabis, and I'm sure that some of our viewers will think, well, but it's wrong, and they'll have an emotional feeling. On the other hand, there'll be some of our viewers who will go, well, it's absolutely right. And they too are not properly informed. We don't know yet. Let me make that point, that while cannabis was banned without scientific investigation, and there doesn't really seem to be a reason why it shouldn't be used. It's certainly, according to Scientific Survey in 2010, The Lancet, leading medical magazine in the world, based here, published the greatest summary of drug use that's ever been made. A group headed by Professor David Nutt at Imperial College, who used to be the head of the Government Advisory Committee on the Misuse of Drugs, until he pointed out that more people die from horse riding than from taking the drug called ecstasy, MDMA, and which is true. More people die from peanuts. In fact, there's some question as to whether anybody's ever died of ecstasy. But even if they have, the numbers of deaths recorded are pretty small, and horse riding should be banned by the same reasoning. If Get a thrill from it.
Well, and it's dangerous, and maybe the horses should be asked questions about whether they like it too. Do they like having somebody sit on their back? Is that nice? No, you see, it's like horses are people too. But to move ourselves out of our culture and be able to think and see things, it actually, the horror is it's not that difficult to teach somebody how to do it. You've existed in an environment where it's encouraged. Disagreement is absolutely encouraged in this household. No, it isn't. No. Missed your chance there. But it is the emotional response that fascinates me, that our religion, our politics, the use of drugs or alcohol, somebody sits there with a cigar in one hand and a glass of whiskey and says drugs are bad.
Yeah.
You're actually taking the two that were found to be the most dangerous in the 2010 Lancet argument. That alcohol is socially the most destructive drug known to man. It is individually the most destructive drug, followed closely by tobacco, nicotine, which kill far more people than heroin, cocaine, amphetamines, barbiturates. But heroin, cocaine, barbiturates, and amphetamines do kill people. We shouldn't lose sight of that. So it's what are the numbers? What's the rational thing to do? Yeah. And that's what critical thinking should be, rather than a formula.
Educate people on the facts. Don't get them to feel the emotion first. I mean, like the DARE program I had in school, where you get to sing songs about how much you hate all the different kinds of drugs without being taught anything about them.
And being told things that aren't true. I mean, I wrote, after looking at the DARE leaflet here, I found that there had been 17 investigations of these programs to see if they're effective, and all 17 had found that children were more likely to take drugs after one of these programs, and the DARE program was the main one that was investigated. And yet in the face of this evidence, they carry on doing it. So I looked at it, and there were some statements made about cannabis that concerned me. One of them was that it may cause cancer. Now that seemed to me a pretty arbitrary statement. Yeah. So I wrote to DARE, and I said, could you point me to the evidence for this assertion? And the response I got was, you can find this material on the internet. The letter I got was actually written by the president of DARE UK. So it had gone right to the top. And he said, we get all of our information from the US. So it's not scientific. It's not fact-based. It's based on, the fat bloke at the pub said this.
I remember the police officer who was presenting the DARE to us told us the story of LSD, that he'd once had a case where somebody had taken it, thought they were an orange, and jumped off the roof of their building.
Because they thought they were an orange?
Yeah.
That's what all oranges are suicidal.
You're making this up, right?
Yeah, it goes back to a case where the CIA dosed a scientist without telling him they were going to do it, with a massive amount of LSD. And he ended Frank Olson, I think was his name. He ended up jumping out of a window. From that came the story that he believed he could fly.
Right.
And that even in 6 Feet Under, you have one of the stories is somebody thinking he can fly and jumping off a roof. Not really, no. Yeah. It's a mythology, it's a fairy story. The point is that, yes, if you take mind-altering substances in the wrong setting, with the wrong group of people, set and setting, then nasty things can happen.
Yeah.
That's absolutely true. Also, of course, if you drink one bottle of whiskey straight down, you can be dead. Yeah. Because it's a drug with such high toxicity. Yet that's not recognised. That everything is according to, it makes me feel so mad about that we become emotional and therefore inflict our values. If we look at the horrors of this, that we're used to tens of thousands of people were burned at the stake, burned alive, because they were believed to be witches. And a test, for example, would be to put a needle into somebody and see if they flinched. And if they didn't flinch, they're a witch. But of course, you can have tissue that has no nerve endings in it. You can, for instance, put a needle through your cheek, as many fakirs in India do, and not bleed and not feel pain, because you can go into a place where there's very little pain. I found this out. I had a fish bone that went through my tongue, and I had to pull it out myself. It was quite unpleasant, but I felt nothing. You know, so there are places. Oh, I'm probably a witch. I've confessed. Okay, we have one more. Stay with us.
To have faith in the possibility of love is a social and not only exceptional individual phenomenon, it is a rational faith based on the insight into the very nature of man.
And we have that faith. We do believe that rather than living a life where, you know, you've got the best designer clothes and the trophy spouse and all of that, that a life that is lived looking after other people, having faith in a progress of humanity towards looking after our habitat and everything within it, you know, so that things get better, is worthwhile, and that to do otherwise is life denying. And we would like to be life affirming. And there's a third one, isn't there? There's a third spectrum. There's life affirming, life denying, narcissism and love. What's the other one? This is crazy. We're missing Fromm's third spectrum. Well, I think we're probably going to have to talk about that somewhere else, because we've already wandered off massively into talking about drugs, which we really shouldn't have done, but he is 18 now, so we're allowed to do it. And we're not suggesting that anybody should take drugs, by the way. We are suggesting that drugs should be studied scientifically, and that we should use reason to arrive at our decisions about how to treat others and what to do in the world. Harming people because of their beliefs is wrong. It doesn't really matter. It's only if those beliefs transform into life-denying or destructive activities that we should be concerned about them. So, Erich Fromm, The Art of Loving, fantastic book. Go out and grab a copy. It's only just over 100 pages long as well, which is always a good thing. And I think it's a very useful way to look at the world. And we will remember what the third spectrum is. And we'll probably do a 5-hour video.
Be a good title, The Third Spectrum.
The Third Spectrum Disorder. Thank you very much. I'm Jon Atack.
I'm Sam Atack.
Drugs are bad.